The fire started just before midnight. Not the orange, roaring kind that frightens a city into the streets, but something quieter and more deliberate. It was April 1527, and in a stone warehouse at the outer edge of Seville's harbour district, a small group of soldiers stood in the amber glow of a controlled burn, watching parchment curl. The smell would have reached the water first. Vellum has a particular scent when it burns, animal and mineral at once, something between singed hair and charred clay. The men standing in that warehouse were not criminals. They were following orders. The orders had come from the Casa de Contratación, Spain's official house of trade, and they were precise. Certain materials were to be reduced to ash by morning. No inventory, no record, no trace. What they were burning were maps. Most of the men worked in silence, lifting rolled charts from wooden crates and feeding them to the flame without pausing to look at what they held. But one of them, a soldier whose name does not survive in any document, stopped. He unrolled the chart slightly in his hands, studied it for a moment in the firelight, and then, instead of feeding it to the flame, he rolled it back tightly and tucked it beneath his coat. We know this happened not because his name was recorded, but because the map still exists. It bears scorch marks along one edge, the kind of damage that comes from proximity to heat rather than immersion in it. Someone held it close to a fire. Someone decided it should not burn. That soldier, whoever he was, is one of the invisible heroes of this story. But the more important question, the question that this entire documentary exists to answer, is not about him. It is about the men who gave the order. What did they know? What were they afraid of? And what, specifically, was on those maps that made an empire reach for fire? Because that night in Seville was not an isolated event. It was one point in a pattern that stretched across 3 centuries and at least 11 documented locations, from Lisbon to Rome, from Salamanca to Mexico City. In each case, the same authority, the same target, the same method, maps, burned, by order. The maps that were destroyed were not inaccurate. They were not fantastical. They were not the work of dreamers or madmen. They were precise, detailed, and keen in ways that historians are still reckoning with. They were correct. They showed a world that the most powerful institutions of their era had decided no one was allowed to see. To understand why that world was so dangerous, we have to start not with the fire, but with the map that survived it. A map that was printed 1,000 times and nearly erased from history. A map that gave an entire continent its name, and then tried, very quietly, to take that name back. In the spring of 1507, in the small town of Saint-Dié, in what is now northeastern France, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller made a decision that would quietly haunt the next 5 centuries of geographic history. He printed a map. Not just any map, the largest printed map the world had yet seen, spanning 12 sheets, 12 feet wide, depicting the full known world in breathtaking, meticulous detail. And in the lower left portion of that map, across a narrow, elongated landmass in the Western Ocean, he wrote a single word, America. It was the first time that word had appeared on any map. Waldseemüller chose it in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine explorer whose letters had been circulating in European scholarly circles, letters describing coastlines and civilizations that Columbus's voyages had begun to reveal. The logic seemed clean. Vespucci had described the place, Waldseemüller named it. 1,000 copies were printed and distributed across Europe. Then something changed. No one knows exactly what. By 1510, Waldseemüller was producing new maps that quietly abandoned the name he had coined. America disappeared from his later work. The continent he had named was relabeled or left unnamed entirely. He seemed to be walking something back, erasing, revision by revision, the very contribution that would make him famous. Historians have speculated about why. Perhaps he received new information. Perhaps he was pressured by patrons. Perhaps he came to doubt the sources he had used when drawing the original. Those sources are the second mystery. The official account says Waldseemüller drew his 1507 map primarily from Vespucci's published letters. But Vespucci's letters describe coastal observations. They do not explain the map's interior accuracy. The 1507 map shows the interior geography of South America with a specificity that should not have been possible. It shows a broad ocean to the west of the landmass, an ocean that European explorers would not officially encounter until Balboa's 1513 crossing of the Isthmus of Panama. Sir Waldseemüller's map shows this ocean 6 years before Balboa reached it. Where did that knowledge come from? Waldseemüller never explained. His source materials have never been identified. The scholars who made the map, a small group gathered under the patronage of Duke René II, left no clear record of how they obtained the geographic data they used. And then there is the question of the copies. 1,000 copies were printed in 1507. By every account, the map was widely distributed and widely admired. It entered the libraries of scholars, churchmen, and merchants across Europe. Yet today, after 5 centuries of archival searching, only one complete copy has ever been found, a single survivor. The other 999 copies of the map that named America have vanished without explanation. Some were almost certainly lost to the normal attrition of history, fire, flood, the simple fragility of paper and time. But the disappearance is complete enough and systematic enough to have drawn the attention of cartographic historians who spend their careers asking uncomfortable questions. One complete copy remains, now housed in the Library of Congress in Washington, purchased by the United States government in 2003 for $10 million, the highest price ever paid for a map. The map that named a continent nearly disappeared. The man who drew it tried to pretend he had not. What he knew and what he was told to forget is one of the quieter mysteries at the heart of this story. Before we can understand why maps were burned, we have to understand what a map actually was in the 15th and 16th centuries. In the modern world, a map is a utility. It tells you how to get somewhere. You consult it, you use it, you forget it. It is infrastructure, like a road sign or a telephone number. In the Renaissance, a map was something else entirely. A map was a political document, a theological statement, an economic weapon, and a classified intelligence report, all at the same time, all pressed onto a single sheet of vellum or parchment. To possess a map of an unexplored coastline was to possess a competitive advantage worth more than a fleet of warships. To possess the wrong map, one that contradicted the claims of a powerful patron, was to possess something worth your life. In 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the entire undiscovered world between them along an invisible vertical line drawn across the Atlantic Ocean. Everything to the west of the line belonged to Spain. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal. The entire arrangement depended on two things: the specific placement of the line and the geographic knowledge of what lay on either side of it. A cartographer who drew that line 1 degree further east or west was, in effect, transferring sovereignty over entire continents. The map was not just a representation of territory. The map was the deed. Portugal understood this with particular clarity. The Portuguese crown maintained something historians refer to as the Padrão Real, the Royal Standard Map. This was a master chart of the world, updated continuously as new voyages returned with new information. I kept under lock in the Casa da India in Lisbon, and never shown to foreign navigators under any circumstances. Copying from it without royal permission was an act of treason, punishable by death. The pilots who used it swore oaths to reveal nothing of what they had seen. Spain maintained equivalent structures. The Casa de Contratación controlled all cartographic output from Spanish explorers. Every pilot who returned from a voyage was required to submit his charts and personal notes directly to the house. Nothing was published. Nothing was shared. The map existed in a single official version, and the official version showed exactly as much as the Crown wished the world to see. In this world, burning a map was not an act of ignorance or fear of knowledge. It was a rational, strategic decision made by intelligent and calculating people who understood the stakes precisely. When they burned a map, they were not destroying curiosity. They were protecting a monopoly. What they burned in the warehouses of Seville and the vaults of Lisbon was not just geography. It was leverage. It was power. And understanding that changes everything about the question we should be asking. Not just what was on those maps, but why those specific maps, and why those specific people were so determined to make sure no one else would ever read them. That question requires us to go back further than the fire. It requires us to go back to the idea that made the burning possible in the first place, the belief, held for over 1,000 years, that there was only one permissible version of the world. It also requires us to understand the specific moment when that belief began to fracture, when the sailors started coming back with coastlines that didn't fit the official picture, when the merchants began trading goods from places that weren't supposed to exist, when the church found itself in possession of an expanding world it had not prepared for and was not sure it could safely acknowledge. The burning was not the beginning of the story. It was the response to a crisis that had already been building for decades. Consider what it felt like to be inside that crisis. You are a cartographer working in Lisbon in 1502. Every week, another ship returns from somewhere the official maps don't show. The sailors bring charts, verbal reports, artifacts, evidence of coastlines that bend in directions Ptolemy never imagined, of winds that blow the wrong way according to the ancient authorities, of stars that appear at latitudes where, by the received wisdom of 1,000 years of scholarship, there should be only ocean. Your job is to record all of this, and your contract specifies that what you record belongs to a king who is not yet sure how much of it he can afford to let anyone know. The tension in that room between what you know and what you are permitted to draw is a tension at the center of this entire story. It shaped every map that survived. It shaped even more completely every map that did not. Imagine the world as a closed room. 3 walls, a ceiling, a floor. Everything that exists fits inside it. Everything that matters can be named and measured. There is no space for what lies beyond the walls, not because nothing is there, but because the room is complete. The room is, by definition, enough. This was the world that Claudius Ptolemy described in Alexandria around 150 AD, and it was the world that held European geographic imagination in a fixed grip for the next 13 centuries. Ptolemy's Geographia was, on its surface, a mathematical treatise, a set of instructions for projecting the spherical Earth onto a flat surface, accompanied by tables of coordinates for thousands of places. It was a work of genuine, scientific sophistication, but it was also inevitably a product of its time and its limitations. Ptolemy knew the Mediterranean world in detail. He knew the outlines of sub-Saharan Africa and the edge of India. Beyond those frontiers, his map dissolved into conjecture, and his conjectures, drawn with the same confident line as his certainties, carried the same authority. The medieval Catholic Church did not simply inherit Ptolemy, it absorbed him. The Geographia was harmonized with scripture, reconciled with the theology of creation, and transformed from a scientific document into something closer to sacred architecture. The TO maps, Orbis Terrarum, the map of the world, placed Jerusalem at the center, Asia at the top, Europe and Africa on either side, the whole enclosed by a ring of impassable ocean. This was not presented as a hypothesis. It was presented as the structure of creation itself. Geography, in this framework, was not a science. It was a branch of theology. The world had a specific shape because God had made it that shape. The boundaries were not cartographic limitations. They were divine intentions. To draw a map that extended beyond those boundaries, that implied lands and peoples beyond the known world, was not just scientifically presumptuous. It was, in the most literal medieval sense, a challenge to the created order. Then the ships began coming back. Portuguese sailors rounding the southern tip of Africa in the 1480s were not simply discovering a sea route. They were bringing back evidence that the world did not end where Ptolemy said it ended. The African continent continued south and west, far beyond his coordinates. The ocean did not behave as he had described. The stars were different, the winds were different, and beyond the Cape of Good Hope lay an ocean of extraordinary breadth, an ocean that appeared on no existing map because no existing framework had room for it. The Church did not respond by immediately revising its cosmology. It entered a period of careful and controlled silence. The new information was acknowledged in private, discussed in Vatican councils, debated in royal courts, but its public implications were managed with enormous care. The maps that showed the new coastlines existed, but in limited, confidential form. The geographic world was changing faster than the theological world could safely accommodate it, and the institution that managed the boundary between those two worlds was not ready to negotiate a new treaty. The maps that emerged from this tension were not innocent documents. They were products of a negotiation between what the sailors had seen and what the church could permit to be drawn. In 1559, the Catholic Church published the first edition of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. Most people today, if they know of the Index at all, think of it as a list of theological and philosophical works that challenge church doctrine. Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes. But embedded in its pages, scattered among the names of philosophers and heretics, were cartographers, specific maps, specific atlases, specific geographic works, banned. Not because they were inaccurate, not because they were fraudulent, because of what they showed. Consider the case of Sebastian Münster, a German scholar whose Cosmographia, first published in 1544, was one of the most widely read geographic works of the 16th century. Münster's maps were meticulous, scholarly, and drawn from the best available sources. They showed inhabited lands beyond the limits of Ptolemy's known world. They depicted peoples and settlements in places where, according to official cosmological doctrine, and there should have been only ocean. Certain editions of the Cosmographia found their way onto the index, the editions that showed the most. Then there was Abraham Ortelius, a Flemish cartographer, whose Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, published in 1570, is generally credited as the world's first modern atlas. Ortelius was careful. He was diplomatic. He published with the blessing of the Spanish crown, dedicated his work to Philip II, and moved through the dangerous waters of his era with extraordinary tact. Yet even Ortelius could not avoid the suspicion of authorities. Certain editions of the Theatrum were seized. Certain pages were ordered removed. The coastlines he drew, accurate, detailed, based on the best available intelligence, were themselves the problem. The pattern sharpens when we look at the Portuguese cartographer Diogo Ribeiro. Ribeiro was the royal cosmographer of Spain in the 1520s, a man employed by the crown, drawing maps on behalf of the crown. His world maps, produced in a series of versions across that decade, contained one piece of information that made them simultaneously invaluable and dangerous. They showed the location of the Moluccas, the Spice Islands of eastern Indonesia, in their precise geographic position relative to the Treaty of Tordesillas Line. The treaty had divided the world between Spain and Portugal. The Moluccas fell on the Portuguese side of the line, which meant Portugal controlled the spice trade, the most lucrative commercial enterprise in the known world. But the precise calculation depended on where exactly you placed the line and where exactly you placed the islands. Ribeiro's maps were modified, versions replaced versions, and the originals, the ones showing the island's true position, were ordered destroyed. None of them have ever been found. Finally, in a category all its own, was the Cantino Planisphere, a map so significant and so sensitive that it had to be stolen out of Portugal rather than published. In 1502, a spy working for the Duke of Ferrara somehow obtained access to Portugal's master chart of the known world, had it secretly copied and smuggled it out of Lisbon, hidden in a shipment of goods. The map that he transported, the most accurate depiction of the early colonial world in existence, survived only because it left the country before the authorities realized it had gone. What do all these cases have in common? The censorship was not random. It was not paranoid. It followed a logic so consistent that it begins to look less like suppression and more like policy. Maps were targeted when they revealed commercial intelligence that competing powers wished to monopolize, when they depicted geographic features that contradicted official political claims, when they showed indigenous civilizations substantial enough to complicate the legal justifications for conquest, or when they implied a world older and more connected than official history acknowledged. The index was not an accident, it was a structure, and like all structures, its shape tells us something about what it was built to contain. There is a particular kind of lie that does not require a single false word. It requires only the careful selection of which truths to omit. Renaissance. Cartographers understood this better than almost anyone. In the blank space on a map was not a confession of ignorance. It was a decision. Someone had to choose to leave it blank, and that choice, in the age of exploration, carried legal and political weight that is difficult to overstate. Consider what a blank space meant. In the legal framework that European powers constructed to justify their colonial claims, territory could only be owned if it was known, named, and possessed by a recognized power. Indigenous peoples, no matter how numerous, how organized, how ancient, did not qualify as recognized powers in this framework. The doctrine of terra nullius held that land belonging to no sovereign recognized by European law was empty land available for claiming. A map that showed large, complex, indigenous civilizations in the interior of a continent directly challenged this doctrine. A map that left that interior blank said something different entirely. Nothing is there, or more precisely, no one that counts is there. The blank space was a legal argument, not a geographic observation. This is the mechanism that historians of colonialism call the epistemology of erasure, the process by which inconvenient knowledge is not simply hidden, but actively converted into ignorance. It is not enough to remove a map from an archive. The removal must leave no trace. The absence must look natural, like the absence of knowledge, not like the presence of a deliberate act. The blank space on a map, when it is well executed, reads as nothing, as the simple absence of data, the honest acknowledgement of an unexplored region. Only when you find the earlier map, the one that was suppressed, do you understand that the blankness was constructed, that it cost someone something to produce, that it was not ignorance, but its sophisticated imitation. The Portuguese knowledge of Australia is one of the clearest examples of deliberate cartographic omission. By the 1520s, Portuguese ships had made contact with the northern coast of Australia. This is not a fringe claim. It is supported by a series of coastal charts held in private Portuguese collections, by the existence of shipwreck artifacts on the Australian coast predating any official European voyage, and by the specific geographic knowledge present in maps produced by Portuguese cartographers in the following decades. Yet official Portuguese maps show no Australian coastline. The continent that Portuguese sailors had reached was kept off the public record for nearly a century, and the reason was commercial. Australia offered no immediately obvious trade advantage. Acknowledging its existence would invite other European powers to investigate and potentially claim it. Portugal's competitive advantage in the eastern trade routes depended on controlling information as much as controlling ships. The blank space where Australia should have been was a strategic asset, a piece of territory held in reserve, off the books, invisible to rivals. The same logic governed the systematic removal of West African interior geography from maps produced after 1550. Earlier maps, drawn when Arab and Moorish geographic traditions still flowed into European cartographic circles, showed the interior of West Africa with remarkable detail: river systems, market cities, population centers, the great trading empires of Mali and Songhai. After 1550, those features began to disappear from official European cartography. The coastline was retained. The coastline was where the slave trade operated, but the interior, with its evidence of sophisticated, organized civilizations, was reduced to blankness. And in the Pacific, there was a pattern of islands appearing and disappearing, present on maps from the early 16th century, then absent from official cartography for decades, then officially rediscovered later. The gaps are too systematic to be explained by cartographic error. Someone removed those islands, waited, and allowed them to be found again on a schedule that suited the needs of colonial administration. Who benefits from a blank space? That is the question the documentary keeps returning to. Not who made it blank, that can often be documented, but who profited from the blankness. And what did they need the blankness to do? The answer, when it comes, is always the same. The blank space was doing the work that a lie would have done more clumsily. And the people who drew those blank spaces were not ignorant. They were obedient. There is a significant difference between those two things, and the people who understood the difference most acutely were the cartographers themselves, the men whose names were on the maps, the men who knew exactly what they were leaving out and why. Picture the cartographer's workspace, not the romanticized version. The open studio with sunlight and paint-stained hands and a globe spinning on a wooden stand. The real version, a locked room, stone walls, a single lamp, the work done at night or behind closed shutters, in a building owned by a patron who also owned the product. A Renaissance cartographer was, in the most precise sense of the term, an intelligence operative. He gathered information from returning sailors, from traders, from diplomats and spies. He synthesized that information into a document that had real geopolitical value. He delivered that document to a patron who used it to make decisions worth enormous sums of money, or to prevent competitors from making those decisions. And he did all of this under a system of surveillance and contractual obligation that would be immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever worked in classified research. Take João de Lisboa, a Portuguese cartographer working in the early 16th century under the patronage of King Manuel I. De Lisboa was one of the finest practitioners of his generation. His surviving charts show navigation knowledge of Antarctic waters that official history places at least 2 decades later than his work. Historians have noted the discrepancy and offered careful explanations, accumulated knowledge from multiple voyages, fragments of Arab geographic tradition, educated extrapolation. None of the explanations are quite satisfying. De Lisboa drew what he drew. He died in 1526, officially at sea, under circumstances that left no documentary trace. Then there was Diego Gutierrez, a Spanish royal cartographer, whose 1562 map of the Americas is one of the most extraordinary geographic documents of the 16th century. It shows interior rivers with specific names, indigenous settlements with specific populations, mountain ranges with specific elevations, detail of a kind that but every official account of Spanish exploration at that date should not have existed. Historians believe Gutierrez was working from sources he was not authorized to possess. He never disclosed what those sources were, and Giovanni Battista Agnese, a Venetian chartmaker who spent his career producing customized manuscript atlases for wealthy and powerful patrons. Agnese made over 70 atlases, each slightly different. Each one was calibrated for its recipient, showing some things in detail, omitting others, placing emphasis in ways that served the interests of the specific person who had commissioned it. In an era before information control had a name, Agnese had turned it into an art form. He knew things. He chose with great care whom to tell, as the contracts that governed these men's work were extraordinary documents in their own right. They specified in explicit legal language that all geographic intelligence gathered in the course of their work belonged to the patron. All notes, all charts, all working materials, the patron's property, the cartographer's personal knowledge, insofar as it could be controlled, was to remain undisclosed. Violation of these terms was not merely a breach of contract. In the case of royal cartographers working for the Spanish or Portuguese crowns, it was treason. What made these men so peculiarly vulnerable was that their value and their danger were the same thing. A cartographer who knew nothing of use could work freely, and a cartographer who knew everything, who had synthesized the intelligence of 100 voyages into a single coherent picture of the world, was too valuable to release and too dangerous to fully trust. He was indispensable right up until the moment he became a liability. And in the Renaissance, the distance between those two positions was measured not in time, but in one careless conversation. Despite the locked rooms and the sworn oaths and the contracts that assigned cartographers knowledge to their patrons like a piece of furniture, geographic intelligence moved across the borders of Renaissance Europe with remarkable speed. It moved through channels that were unofficial, often illegal, and sometimes extraordinarily clever. The first of these channels ran through the Jewish communities of the Iberian Peninsula and their diaspora, and the Cresques family of Majorca, Father Abraham and son Jafuda, were among the most accomplished cartographers of the 14th century. Their Catalan atlas of 1375 was the most accurate map of the known world produced in that era, and it drew on geographic knowledge that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the markets of Central Asia. The Cresques family had commercial connections that crossed every border their maps depicted. When Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in 1497, the cartographic knowledge embedded in those communities did not vanish. It travelled. Families carrying geographic intelligence in their heads and in their private manuscripts moved into the Ottoman Empire, into the Netherlands, into North Africa. The Ottoman cartographic tradition of the early 16th century, which produced, among other things, the remarkable Piri Reis map, was fed in part by knowledge arriving through these displaced networks. The expulsion, intended to consolidate power, instead scattered the most sophisticated geographic knowledge in the world across a dozen different nations. The second major channel ran through the Jesuit order. From their founding in 1540, the Jesuits were simultaneously missionaries, scholars, and surveyors. Their missions to China, Japan, the Congo, and the Amazon required geographic knowledge, and in acquiring it, they produced it. Jesuit cartographers mapped territories that official state cartography would not reach for decades. Their observations were transmitted back to Rome through the order's secure internal communication networks, and they accumulated in Vatican archives in a form that was simultaneously preserved and suppressed. The maps existed. They were simply never made public. In this context, the figure of Andrea Bianco deserves careful attention. Bianco was a Venetian cartographer working in the 1430s and 1440s, at a time when Portuguese exploration of the Atlantic was still in its early decades. His charts of the eastern Atlantic are accomplished but unremarkable, except for one detail. On Bianco's 1436 chart, south of the Canary Islands, there appears a large landmass, labelled in his hand as Ixola Authentica, usually translated as Authentic Island. It appears at a distance and in a direction from the African coast that corresponds with unsettling precision to the location of the Brazilian coast. Bianco drew it in 1436, and Pedro Álvares Cabral officially reached Brazil in 1500, 64 years later. Historians have offered various explanations: a legendary island, a misplaced Atlantic archipelago, an error. But Bianco was not a careless man. His other work shows careful observation and reliable measurement, and he was part of a trading network that connected Venice to the growing Portuguese Atlantic enterprise at exactly the period when the most sensitive voyages were being made and the most sensitive information was being suppressed. The question of how Bianco knew what he drew has never been satisfactorily answered. What is certain is that the answer lies somewhere in those informal networks, the merchants and pilots and displaced scholars who carried geographic knowledge across borders that official cartography was not supposed to cross. And then there is the Vatican. The secret archives of the Holy See, now officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive, contain over 85 linear kilometers of shelved documents. Among them are more than 100,000 cartographic items. The majority of this collection has never been fully catalogued. Researchers who have been granted access describe a storeroom of geographic knowledge so vast and so poorly organized that meaningful survey work would take generations. What is in those archives is not known. What arrived there through the Jesuit networks, through confiscated materials, through the accumulated geographic intelligence of a church that spanned the globe for centuries, that is a question that remains formally unanswered. 100,000 maps, uncatalogued, in a locked building in Rome. It is one of the largest unexplored archives in the world, and the people who control it have not so far seen fit to explain its contents to anyone outside their walls. There is a contradiction at the heart of the Renaissance cartographic enterprise that no one involved in it could resolve, and very few could comfortably acknowledge. The kings who funded exploration were also the faithful sons of a church that officially did not believe in the world those explorers were finding. The ships that brought back evidence of a larger, stranger world were paid for by the same treasuries that funded cathedrals built on the assumption of a smaller, simpler one. The cartographer caught between these two authorities had no clean options. He could draw what the sailors had seen and risk the displeasure of the church. He could draw what the church permitted and risk the displeasure of a king who needed accurate charts to defend his territorial claims. Or he could develop the specific diplomatic skill that separated the survivors from those who disappeared, the ability to draw two versions of the truth simultaneously, each one satisfying to a different reader. Pedro Reynel and his son Jorge were perhaps the most accomplished practitioners of this art. Working in Portugal across the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Reynels produced charts of the Indian Ocean, the African coast, and the Southeast Asian archipelagos that were the finest navigational documents of their era. Their knowledge of the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, was particularly precise, which made their work simultaneously indispensable and explosive. In the Treaty of Tordesillas had drawn a line through the world. The Moluccas sat near that line, on which side depended on exactly where you measured from, and exactly how you counted the degrees of longitude. Portugal said one side, Spain said the other. The truth, insofar as the Reynolds could calculate it, was that the islands fell into Portuguese territory, a calculation that Spain could not afford to acknowledge. In 1523, father and son were summoned before a royal commission to testify about their charts. The documents from that hearing survive in the Portuguese archives. The charts that prompted the hearing do not. They appear to have been removed. What is perhaps most striking about the Reynolds story is not its drama, but its mundanity. Being called before a commission to justify your maps, having your maps confiscated, in being required to produce alternative versions that reached more convenient conclusions. This was not a remarkable event in the world of Renaissance cartography. It was a professional hazard. Among the papers held in the General Archive of Simancas in northern Spain, there is a letter that cartographic historians have returned to repeatedly because of what it reveals about the inner life of the men who drew these maps. The letter was written by an unnamed cartographer. His name has either been removed or was never recorded, to a cardinal in Rome. It asks with evident anxiety whether the act of drawing an accurate map of the world, a map that showed the world as it truly was, in all its complexity and extent, would endanger the salvation of his soul. He was not asking whether it would endanger his career, or his commission, or his freedom. He was asking about his soul. The question was not rhetorical. He meant it. The cardinal did not write back, or if he did, that reply has not survived. The cartographer's question hangs in the archive, unanswered, for 5 centuries, the voice of a man who had looked at the whole world and was afraid of what seeing it clearly might cost him. That fear, not of punishment, not of poverty, but of the moral weight of knowing too much, is the undertow of this entire story. The men who drew the edges of the world were not bold adventurers, cheerfully mapping the unknown. They were careful, frightened, contractually constrained individuals, living inside a system that needed their knowledge, but could not safely acknowledge everything that knowledge implied. Some of them managed that tension for decades, and some of them did not manage it at all. The year was 1550, and Seville was at the center of the world. Every ship that left for the Americas passed through it. Every cargo that returned, silver, tobacco, hides, the administrative records of a growing empire, passed through it. The Casa de Contratación, the house of trade, sat in the heart of the city like a machine for processing the new world and converting it into the known one. It had offices, warehouses, courtrooms, and archives. In its basement vaults were stored the most sensitive geographic documents in the Spanish Empire. In the summer of that year, an official review was ordered. The Casa's geographic materials were to be examined, inventoried, and justum, where necessary, purged. The records of that review survive, held today in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, so accessible to researchers. They are one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of cartography. The bureaucrats who conducted the review were thorough. Before each item was destroyed, they recorded its dimensions, its general content, its cartographer's name, where known, and the reason for its destruction. The reason was almost always the same, written in the dry administrative language of the era. It contains information that is not consistent with the Crown's official geographic record. What this means, translated into plain language, is it shows too much. The inventories reveal 3 categories of materials that were targeted with particular consistency. First, charts showing the Pacific coast of North America in a detail that implied exploration far beyond the official record. The Spanish had official knowledge of the California coast from certain documented voyages. These maps showed something further north, a coastline with harbours and headlands and specific geographic features that suggested extended observation, not a single passing sail. Second, maps of the South American interior depicting indigenous cities of a scale that flatly contradicted the colonial narrative being constructed at that moment. The idea that Spanish conquest had encountered scattered, primitive peoples in an empty wilderness. Third, charts showing the Western Pacific approaches with navigational detail about island chains and sea routes that, if circulated, would have given Spain's competitors precise intelligence about the most profitable ocean passages in the world. The clerks worked through their inventory for weeks. Each item was recorded, then destroyed. Recorded, then destroyed. The irony is immense in their meticulous, bureaucratic act of preservation through documentation. The clerks of the Casa de Contratación accidentally created the only record of what was being lost. The destruction registry is itself the evidence. At the very end of the inventory, there is one entry that has attracted more attention than any other. It describes a map, the Great Northern Chart, origin unknown, measuring in excess of 6 feet in length. The clerk noted that it depicted a coastline he could not identify, with geographic annotations in a hand he did not recognize. He recorded its dimensions and its approximate content. He noted dryly that it had been brought in with a collection of uncatalogued materials, and then he destroyed it. And no map matching that description has ever been found. It had no name, it had no known maker. It showed something, some coastline, some place, some knowledge accumulated from some voyage or some compilation of voyages that its final custodians decided the world did not need to see, and whatever it showed died with it in the summer heat of a Seville office, in a room whose walls have since been torn down and rebuilt and torn down again. The Great Northern Chart, origin unknown, 6 feet long, a coastline no clerk could identify, burned without ceremony on a bureaucratic schedule because someone decided it did not fit. The 1550 Purge was the largest documented single event of its kind, but it was not the first and it was not the last. Across 3 centuries and at least 4 major European empires, there is a pattern of cartographic destruction so consistent in its targets, its methods, and its timing that it begins to look less like a series of independent decisions and more like an inherited protocol, something passed from administration to administration, like a standard operating procedure for the management of dangerous knowledge. In 1497, King Manuel I of Portugal issued a formal order to his pilots, before sharing any information with foreign navigators, regardless of rank, regardless of relationship, all charts showing the African Sea route to India were to be removed from view. Pilots who had made the voyage were specifically instructed not to describe what they had seen to any non-Portuguese party. The route itself, the Cape of Good Hope passage, was the most valuable commercial secret in the world. Portugal had found it. Portugal intended to keep it. In 1504, the Board of the Indies in Lisbon ordered a review of all geographic materials held in the royal archives. A Franciscan friar named Gaspar, who witnessed the resulting destruction, wrote a letter to his superior that survived by chance in the monastic correspondence files. He described watching charts being burned in a courtyard and said only that he found it against the nature of knowledge, a phrase so measured and so precise that it reads across 5 centuries like a man choosing his words very carefully because he knows other men are reading his letters. In 1580, the estate of the Portuguese cartographer Bartolomeu Velho was subject to a royal order of confiscation following his death. Soldiers conducted the seizure. A neighbour who witnessed it described the scene in a private letter. The soldiers arriving at the house, the boxes and rolled manuscripts being carried out, the cartographer's widow standing in the doorway. The letter survives, the maps do not. In 1617, Inquisition officials seized an unnamed Venetian atlas from the library of a Jesuit college in Salamanca. The college's intake registry records its arrival and its content in careful detail. There is no record of its return. 11 documented events, spread across a century and a quarter, across 5 different administrative and ecclesiastical authorities, targeting materials in Lisbon, Seville, Rome, Salamanca, and Mexico City. Each event was followed by a period of heightened official cartographic output. New maps, revised maps, official maps that showed the world in a form that the destroying authority preferred. 4 elements recur in every case. Every destroyed collection was drawn from the Atlantic world rather than the Mediterranean. These were maps of the new discoveries, not the old knowledge. Every destruction was authorized by state or church power, rather than by private actors acting independently. Every targeted collection contained materials that either revealed commercial intelligence or implied a chronology of exploration that contradicted official accounts, and every destruction was preceded by a period of political tension around geographic claims, a treaty dispute, a territorial competition, a colonial legal proceeding that required the historical record to look a certain way. The pattern is not a conspiracy, in the sense that conspiracy theorists use the word, not a secret agreement among a shadowy few. It is something more ordinary and more disturbing. It is institutional behavior, a pattern of response so consistent that it suggests not individual malice, but systemic logic. A world in which destroying inconvenient knowledge was simply what responsible administrators did when the situation required it. The men who gave those orders were not villains in their own estimation. They were stewards of empire, protecting the investments of their sovereigns and the doctrines of their church. The burning was not rage, it was housekeeping. That is, in some ways, the most unsettling thing about it. Burning a map leaves ash, but the people who ordered maps destroyed were not interested in ash. They were interested in the permanent, irrecoverable elimination of knowledge, and they understood that fire was only the first step. A thorough erasure required 3 separate operations, working at 3 different levels, each one designed to eliminate a different form of evidence. The first level was physical. Vellum and paper maps were burned rather than cut or torn because the Casa de Contratacion's own guidelines noted that cut fragments could be reassembled. Immersion in water was used for materials in quantities too large or too damp to burn efficiently. The guidelines were specific about temperature, about wind direction, about ensuring complete combustion. These were not the instructions of men acting in haste. They were the instructions of men who had thought carefully about what complete destruction required. The second level was administrative. Removing a map from existence was insufficient if the map's existence had been recorded elsewhere. Inventories were revised. Acquisition registers were amended. The names of cartographers whose work had been destroyed were quietly removed from official lists of commissioned artists. In at least one documented case from 1531 in a Spanish colonial court, a pilot was required to swear under oath that he had never possessed or viewed any chart of the Pacific north of Panama. The oath was required because he had demonstrably viewed such a chart. His own correspondence, held elsewhere in the same archive, referenced it explicitly. The administrative erasure was required to resolve the contradiction. The third level was the subtlest and in some ways the most revealing. Rather than destroying certain maps outright, authorities had them altered. A coastline was scraped from the vellum and redrawn in a different position. Annotations were removed. A legend was changed. The map was filed in the official collection as a new document, and the previous version, the accurate one, was destroyed. Modern imaging technology has caught these alterations in the act. Infrared reflectography, a technique that reads the chemical residue of earlier inscriptions beneath visible layers of paint or ink, has been applied to several surviving maps from major institutional collections. In a number of cases, it has revealed something that stops researchers cold. Beneath the visible map, there is an earlier map. The same parchment, different lines, a coastline that extends further, an inland feature that was removed, a name that was changed. The visible map and the hidden map tell different stories about the same piece of the world. The hidden map, in several cases, is more accurate than the one on top. Someone painted a lie over a truth, filed the lie in an official archive, and destroyed the truth, or thought they did. The chemistry of old ink does not follow administrative orders. it persists, invisible to the naked eye, waiting for a machine that did not exist when it was buried to finally read it back into the light. There is one more thing worth noting about the 3 levels of erasure. Together, they reveal a sophisticated and premeditated approach to the control of knowledge. Not a reactive measure, but a planned system. The people who designed this system understood that knowledge has multiple residues. It exists in the physical object, in the administrative record, and in the material trace. To truly eliminate it, you had to work at all 3 levels simultaneously. That understanding implies a prior history of attempting to do this, getting it wrong, and learning from the failures. The burning rooms were not improvised. They were practiced. And what they practiced on, before the records we can still find, is something we can only guess at. There is a map, held in the J.E. Kislak collection at the Library of Congress in Washington, that was made in 1506. It is called the Contarini-Rosselli map, named for Giovanni Matteo Contarini and Francesco Rosselli, the Venetian cartographer and engraver who produced it. It is the earliest surviving printed map to show any part of the American continents, and it was made 14 years after Columbus's first voyage. And the map shows the Amazon River, not approximately, not as a speculative feature based on vague reports from coastal voyages. The Amazon, as depicted in the Contarini-Rosselli map, bears specific characteristics: the eastward curve of its lower course, the general scale of its basin relative to the surrounding coast, the relationship of its mouth to the Atlantic, that correspond to what we know about the river from centuries of subsequent observation. It is not a perfect depiction, but it is far more accurate than it should be. The first European expedition to travel the length of the Amazon, Francisco de Orellena's voyage, did not take place until 1541, 35 years after this map was made. Someone had information about the Amazon in 1506 that has no official explanation. Where it came from, who gathered it, and how it arrived in Venetian cartographic circles without leaving a documentary record. These are questions that the academic literature has approached with admirable caution and has not ultimately resolved. The Contarini-Rosselli map is not alone. Across the period between roughly 1490 and 1515, a series of maps appeared in European circulation that contained geographic knowledge of the Americas beyond what the documented voyages of those years could account for. The pattern is not uniform. Not every map shows the anomaly, and the anomalies themselves are of different kinds and different degrees of specificity. But they cluster around the same problem: too much knowledge, appearing too early, with insufficient explanation. The Piri Reis map, produced in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Haji Muhyiddin Piri ibn Haji Mehmed, is the most discussed example. Piri Reis was explicit that he drew it from a compilation of source maps, including, he claimed, maps captured from Christopher Columbus himself. His South American coastline is accurate to a degree that 18th century cartographers, working without his sources, could not match. The western coast of Africa and the eastern coast of South America, in his map, show a separation that corresponds closely to what we now know about the opening of the South Atlantic, knowledge that requires either precise measurement or a very early source. Then there is the matter of the New World plant species in European art, maize native to the Americas, unknown in Europe before 1492, appears in carved stonework at Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, generally dated to the 1490s. To pineapples appear in European artworks from the early 15th century. Traces of cocaine derived from the coca plant, which grew only in South America, have been identified in Egyptian mummies from the early first millennium. None of these individual data points constitute proof of pre-Columbian contact. Together, they form a body of evidence that is awkward to dismiss and difficult to explain within the official timeline. The scholarly debate around pre-Columbian contact is not fringe territory. It is conducted in peer-reviewed journals by researchers at major universities using methods that include carbon dating, chemical analysis, and comparative linguistics. The debate's existence does not mean that every alternative timeline is credible. Most are not. It means that the official account leaves specific, undocumented gaps that serious researchers have identified and have not yet filled. What does this have to do with the burning maps? It has everything to do with them. If certain Renaissance maps contained evidence of pre-Columbian contact that predated Columbus, that implied an earlier and richer history of Atlantic navigation than the official record acknowledges, then those maps were not just geographically inconvenient, they were historically dangerous. They implied a world that had been reached and known, and then, for reasons that remain unclear, forgotten or suppressed. The burning was not protecting a secret about where the Amazon was. It was protecting a secret about when, and by whom, the world had first been known. That is a different kind of secret, a geographic secret. This coastline is here, this island is there, becomes obsolete the moment someone else arrives and confirms it, but a historical secret. This world was already known before you were told it was discovered, does not become obsolete. It becomes more dangerous with time, because its implications grow with each new piece of confirming evidence. Every accurate pre-Columbian map is not just a curiosity, it is a challenge to a story that entire legal and political systems were built upon, and it is in the nature of those systems to resist revision, not through argument, but through the removal of evidence. Before we follow the more speculative threads too far, it is worth pausing on the most concrete and least mysterious explanation for the burning of maps, because the most concrete explanation is, in its own way, just as extraordinary as the more obscure ones. The spice trade. To a modern sensibility, the idea that nutmeg could justify a war seems faintly absurd. Nutmeg is a kitchen staple, sold in small glass jars, unremarkable. In 15th century Europe, it was none of those things. Nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and cinnamon were luxury goods of the highest order, used as medicine, as preservatives, as status markers, as the currency of aristocratic hospitality. A merchant who controlled the supply of cloves controlled a commodity worth more per pound than silver. The Moluccas, the tiny, volcanic islands of eastern Indonesia that were the only place on earth where nutmeg and cloves grew, were, in the economic imagination of the Renaissance, the most valuable real estate in the world. Everything about the Treaty of Tordesillas can be understood in this context. The line drawn through the Atlantic in 1494 was not drawn for geographic neatness. It was drawn because Portugal and Spain needed a formula for dividing the world between them that both could accept. And the formula had to be based on something measurable. That something was longitude, the east-west position of any given point on the Earth's surface. And the question of which side of the Tordesillas line the Moluccas fell on was, in the most literal financial sense, worth billions. Diego Ribeiro understood this better than almost anyone. As Spain's royal cosmographer in the 1520s, Ribeiro was responsible for producing the official Spanish version of where the Tordesillas line fell and what lay on each side of it. His maps of the world were not academic exercises. They were legal arguments dressed in cartographic language. Spain's case, it made visible for why the Moluccas belonged to the Spanish Empire. But Ribeiro was a careful man and an honest cartographer, and those two qualities created a problem. His calculations, based on the best available geographic data, suggested that the Moluccas sat on the Portuguese side of the line. This was not the answer his patron needed. Over the course of the 1520s, Ribeiro produced multiple versions of his world map, each one with a slightly different placement of the critical longitude. In some versions, the islands are slightly further east, in others, slightly further west. The variations are small enough to be attributable to measurement uncertainty, but they are systematically biased in the direction that served Spanish interests. The versions that placed the islands in Portuguese territory were ordered destroyed, and the version that was sent to Rome for the papal arbitration of the dispute, a version whose coastlines had been adjusted after completion, with the adjustment made by a different hand, survives in the Vatican collections. The original, unmodified Ribeiro map has never been found. What Ribeiro's story makes clear is that map burning was not primarily a theological or even a political act. It was a financial act. The most consistently targeted maps were the ones with the highest commercial value, the ones that showed the precise location of profitable trade routes, the navigable passages through difficult waters, the position of islands whose products could make a merchant family wealthy for generations. Burning those maps was not destroying knowledge, it was protecting a monopoly. It was the medieval equivalent of a corporation deleting a competitor's technology from every server it could reach. The religious justifications were real. The political justifications were real, but follow the money, and the logic of the burning becomes almost elegant in its clarity. Someone had a piece of information. That information was worth an enormous amount if it remained exclusive. Making it disappear was worth whatever it cost to make it disappear. In this light, the burning was not ignorance or fear. It was the most rational possible response to an information economy in which maps were currency, and destroying a map was the equivalent of withdrawing that currency from circulation forever. There is a third category of map content that is less discussed than the pre-Columbian contact question and less immediately obvious than the trade route intelligence, but that, on reflection, may be the most consequential of all. It is the depiction of cities, not coastlines, not sea routes, cities. In 1516, Martin Waldseemüller produced what he called the Carta Marina, a follow-up to his famous 1507 map, intended as a more practical navigational document. The Carta Marina contained, in its interior annotations for the North American continent, a series of references to organized settlements in the Mississippi River Valley. Settlements described with specific enough detail to imply first-hand accounts or reports from observers who had traveled inland. Official Spanish and French colonial history does not acknowledge any exploration of the Mississippi interior for another century. The Carta Marina survives today in 2 copies. Every other copy that was printed, and it was printed in multiple editions, appears to have been destroyed. 2 copies from an edition that circulated widely across European scholarly circles survive. The others are simply gone. In the collections of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, there is a series of Brazilian coastal charts from the 1510s whose existence was unknown to mainstream academic cartographic history until 1985, when a researcher working on an unrelated project identified them in a miscatalogued collection. The charts are remarkable for what they show, not just the coastal outline of Brazil, which was known from Cabral's 1500 voyage, but detailed interior geography, river systems, settlements, populations, trade routes. The populations implied by these charts are significantly larger than the numbers that appear in the official colonial records compiled by Portuguese administrators in the same period. There is a word for what the colonial administrators were doing when they compiled those records. They were practicing the doctrine of terra nullius, empty land, the legal principle that land inhabited by peoples without a recognized government, without written law, without the specific institutional structures that European legal tradition considered markers of sovereignty, was available for claiming. The principle required not just legal argument, it required cartographic support. A map that showed large, complex, organized civilizations undermined the argument directly. The Niger Bend maps are perhaps the most striking case. Before 1500, Moorish geographic scholars in North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula produced maps of West Africa's interior that depicted the great cities of the Mali and Songhai empires with extraordinary specificity. Timbuktu, Jenny, Gao, cities with populations in the tens of thousands, with universities and markets and architectural traditions that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. These maps entered European cartographic tradition briefly. In the late 15th century, carried by the same scholarly networks that transmitted Arabic geographic knowledge to European centers of learning. After the mid-16th century, those features disappeared from official European maps of West Africa. The interior became blank. The cities became unnamed. The populations became invisible. The coastline, where the slave trade was most active, was retained in detail. The interior, which would have required acknowledging the existence of highly organized, densely populated civilizations in the areas being raided for slaves, was quietly erased. The connection is not subtle. It is direct, documented, and has been noted by scholars working in the history of cartography and the history of the Atlantic slave trade for decades. Maps that showed a full and complex Africa undermined the intellectual and legal infrastructure of a trade that was generating enormous wealth for the powers that maintained it. Those maps were removed from circulation. The world they depicted, the real world, the accurate world, was replaced with a simpler, emptier, more convenient one. And the flames were not hiding secrets about geography. They were hiding secrets about people, about the scale and sophistication of the human world that European expansion was encountering, and in many places destroying. The most dangerous thing on those maps was not a coastline or a sea route. It was a city that officially was not supposed to be there. Most of the cartographers in this story did not die dramatically. They lived ordinary lives, or something close to it, and died of ordinary things, and left ordinary administrative traces in the archives of the countries that employed them. But at the edges of the profession, in the places where geographic knowledge became most sensitive, there is a cluster of cases that do not resolve cleanly. Men who disappear from the record, estates confiscated with unusual speed, circumstances of death noted only in passing, without the documentation that the era's bureaucratic culture would normally have produced. Bartolomeo Columbus is not the famous Columbus. That was his brother Christopher. But Bartolomeo was, in some respects, the more technically accomplished cartographer of the two. He worked in the Lisbon Royal Workshop before joining his brother's later voyages, and after the discovery of the Caribbean islands, he produced a series of charts that showed the geographic relationship between those islands and the papal line of demarcation with a precision that the Spanish crown found deeply uncomfortable. The charts implied that certain territories fell on the Portuguese side of the line. Bartolomeo was removed from his position. His charts from this period have never been found. So he spent the last years of his life in a kind of administrative limbo, stripped of his title, stripped of his income, stripped of any official role in the geographic enterprise he had helped to build. Lorenz Reis was an Alsatian cartographer and physician who produced multiple updated editions of Ptolemy's Geographia in the 1520s. His editions were careful, scholarly, and included the best available contemporary geographic data, including information about Pacific coastlines that reflected actual navigational knowledge, but that Spanish authorities considered strategically sensitive. In 1525, copies of one of Fries's editions were seized at the Frankfurt Book Fair by officials acting on behalf of the Spanish crown. Fries was summoned before a council, and what happened next is historically murky. His biography for the following several years is fragmentary, in a way that suggests either a deliberate erasure of the record or a period of such diminished public activity that he left almost no trace. And then there is the case of the draw. In the official documents of Diego de Almagro's 1535 South American expedition, the exploration of present-day Chile that represented the furthest southern penetration of Spanish colonial enterprise up to that point, there is a recurring reference to an unnamed individual described only as El Dibujante, the drawer. His function was to produce charts of the coastlines and interior geography encountered during the expedition. He apparently did so with some skill, since the references to him suggest his work was valued. So the expedition returned to Peru in 1536. The drawer came back with it. After that, he does not appear again. No death record, no further employment, no letters, no legal documents, no inventories of an estate. He was alive in 1536 and absent from all subsequent records, not missing in the sense that his records might be lost elsewhere, but absent in the sense of a life that simply stopped producing documentary evidence at the moment he completed his most sensitive work. The charts he made, the charts of the Chilean coast and interior, with their evidence of a southern Pacific passage, have also never been found. The drawer is the purest example of what historians call absence as evidence. In an era when even minor figures left administrative residue, tax records, church records, property records, in contracts, a total absence of documentation after a specific moment is itself a kind of document. It says, this person's story was managed, the ending was controlled, and someone decided that the drawer, along with his drawings, should not have a legible future. In Lisbon, in the early 16th century, every royal cartographer who accepted a commission from the Portuguese crown signed a document. It was several pages long, written in the careful legal Portuguese of the era, and it bound the signatory in ways that went considerably beyond a standard employment contract. It specified that all maps, charts, notes, and working materials produced during the commission were the exclusive property of the Crown. It specified that geographic knowledge acquired during the commission could not be shared with any foreign party, regardless of their rank or their relationship to the cartographer. It specified that violation of these terms was a capital offence. The document had a name. It was called the Juramento do Silencio, the Oath of Silence. Every royal cartographer in Portugal signed it. Every pilot who sailed under royal commission swore a version of it. The oath was not a formality. It was enforced. There are documented cases of pilots being prosecuted for sharing navigational information with foreign sailors. There are cases of cartographers being recalled from commissions and placed under house arrest while their materials were inventoried and confiscated. The enforcement was not uniform. Powerful patrons could protect their people to a degree, but the mechanism existed and was used. In Spain, the Casa de Contradicción operated a similar system, and cartographers working from its charts signed contracts that specified absolute crown ownership of all intelligence. Personal notes were subject to confiscation. The cartographer's instruments, the tools of his trade, the physical equipment he needed to practice his craft, were technically the property of the crown at the moment he accepted a commission. A cartographer who left the crown's service did not take his expertise with him. As a free man takes a marketable skill, he took it as a liability. Beyond the legal mechanisms, there was a more informal but equally effective system of professional control, reputation. In the small, interconnected world of Renaissance cartography, a world where the best practitioners all knew each other, corresponded with each other, sometimes trained each other, a rumour of indiscretion spread quickly and cost dearly. A cartographer suspected of sharing intelligence with a foreign power would find his commissions drying up. His published work would be attributed to collaborators, minimizing his individual visibility. His name would quietly disappear from the circles where recommendations were made and positions were filled. A letter from the Venetian ambassador in Lisbon, written in 1504 and preserved in the Venetian state archives, describes the atmosphere among Portuguese cartographers at that moment with a precision that cuts through the diplomatic language. The ambassador was writing about the difficulty of obtaining any geographic intelligence from Portuguese sources. He noted that the cartographers and pilots of Lisbon lived in a state of extreme caution. His phrase, in which no one spoke openly about what they had seen or drawn, because all know what has become of those who did. He did not specify what had become of those who did. He assumed his reader would understand the architecture of intimidation was not designed to produce silence through terror. It was designed to produce silence through the rational calculation of self-interest. A cartographer who kept his knowledge to himself would keep his commission, his income, and his social position. A cartographer who did not would lose all three. The most effective form of information control is not the one that frightens people into silence. It is the one that makes silence the obviously correct professional choice. The Portuguese and Spanish crowns had by the early 16th century built exactly that system, and it worked with notable, documented, and often very strange exceptions. In 1512, Amerigo Vespucci died in Seville of what was recorded as malaria. He was 58 years old. He had, in the months before his death, been serving as pilot major of Spain, the highest cartographic office in the Spanish colonial administration, the official custodian of all Spanish geographic intelligence. Everything that was known about the Americas in official Spanish cartography had at some point passed through his hands or his office. His personal papers were not found after his death. His private charts, the accumulated record of his own observations, and the observations he had reviewed in his official capacity were not inventoried. His library was not catalogued. Of a man who had sailed more of the Atlantic world than almost anyone alive, and who had then spent years receiving and reviewing the charts of everyone else who had sailed it, there remains in the Spanish and Italian archives essentially nothing of a personal cartographic nature. In an era when scholars hoarded their papers like treasure, when humanist libraries were passed to heirs with the care of family jewels, when a scholar's death was typically followed by an inventory of everything he owned, down to the last quill, the most important cartographer in Spain died and left nothing. No maps, no notes, no working materials. Then there was João de Lisboa, whose charts showed Antarctic waters. He died in 1526. The cause of death is recorded in the single document that references it, only as at sea. No expedition member recorded his death. No account of the circumstances, the ship, the location, the date was written down. He simply was, and then, with the administrative finality of a closed file, he was not. And Giacomo Gastaldi, a Venetian cartographer of the mid-16th century, Gastaldi produced some of the most accurate maps of Asia and the Americas made in his era. In the 1560s, his work began to show something that alarmed Spanish colonial authorities: geographic relationships between the Pacific coast of North America and the Asian coastline that suggested a closer proximity than Spain's territorial claims could comfortably accommodate. The implications for the Northwest Pacific trade, for access to Japan, to China, to the northern sea routes were significant. Gastaldi died in 1566. 3 days after his death, Venetian officials, acting at the formal request of the Spanish ambassador, arrived at his studio and removed his final works. Those works have never been publicly documented or displayed. The narrator of this story does not claim that Amerigo Vespucci was murdered. It does not claim that João de Lisboa was thrown from a ship It makes no accusation of murder in the case of Gastaldi or any other cartographer. What it does is present a statistical observation that historians have noted, examined, and declined to fully explain. Of the 14 most significant cartographers of the early Atlantic exploration era, 10 left incomplete or fragmentary final records. 7 died without their personal papers being inventoried. 5 had their estates subject to state confiscation within 1 year of their death. Is this a pattern, or is it a coincidence made to look like a pattern by the selective attention of people who already suspect a pattern? The honest answer is that the data does not permit certainty, but the pattern is there, consistent enough to deserve acknowledgement, strange enough to resist dismissal. The men who knew the most about the world, who had synthesized in their heads and their notes and their charts a more accurate picture of the Earth's surface than anyone else possessed, had a notable tendency, at the end of their lives, to leave nothing behind. As if, at the moment of maximum danger, someone had known exactly where to look and exactly what to take. In 1929, workers renovating the library of an Augustinian monastery in Venice broke through a section of wall that had been sealed, by all appearances, for several centuries. Inside the cavity, a stone niche in the thick medieval masonry, dry and dark and completely undisturbed, they found a collection of rolled manuscripts bound in oilcloth. Among them were 3 nautical charts. They were dated, by their cartographic style and the materials used, to the early 16th century. They showed the Pacific coast of South America in a geographic detail that the officially documented European knowledge of that coast at that date could not explain. They bore no cartographer's name. There was no accompanying document, no letter, no explanation of who had placed them there or why. The monastery's own records provided the only context available. They showed that the library had been subject to an official inspection in 1551, a period of heightened inquisitorial scrutiny of geographic and scientific materials across the Venetian territories. The inspection had been thorough. It had resulted in the removal of several items from the library's official holdings. But whoever had hidden the nautical charts in the wall had done so before the inspectors arrived, tucking them into a space that would not be found until the wall itself was demolished. They never came back for the charts. That silence, the 4-century absence of any attempt to retrieve what had been so carefully hidden, is itself a kind of testimony. Something had happened. Someone had hidden knowledge at a moment of danger and had then, for whatever reason, been unable to return to it. This is not an isolated case. The great institutional libraries of Europe, built over centuries, organized according to archaic and sometimes impenetrable systems, staffed by scholars who catalogued meticulously but could not always know what they were cataloguing, became inadvertently some of the most effective archives of suppressed knowledge in history. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France holds hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, a significant portion of which remain uncatalogued or miscatalogued to this day. The Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana in Florence, one of the oldest libraries in the world, contains materials whose origins and acquisition history are, by the library's own records, unclear. The Bodleian Library in Oxford holds cartographic materials that arrived in its collections through donations and bequests so old and so poorly documented that their provenance is effectively unknown. These institutions were not hiding things deliberately. They were simply too large, too old, and too understaffed to know everything they contained. And in that institutional entropy, in the gap between the vast collection and the limited capacity to catalogue it, forbidden maps found the safest environment available. Not the deliberate concealment of a hidden niche, but the accidental obscurity of a misfiled document in a room full of a million other documents. The great irony of cartographic suppression is this: the most effective archive of forbidden maps was not a secret vault or a revolutionary's hidden library. It was bureaucratic chaos. The blank space on a catalogue card, the miscatalogued box, the donated collection, whose contents no one had reviewed in 200 years. These were the sanctuaries where knowledge went to wait, quietly, until someone thought to look for it. Behind every surviving forbidden map, there is a human decision, not the decision to burn it. That decision is well documented, institutionally sanctioned, and historically unambiguous. The decision to not burn it, to copy it, to hide it, to pass it along. These decisions were made by specific people, in specific moments, at specific personal risk, for reasons that are sometimes documented and sometimes can only be inferred. They are the invisible counterweight to the burning rooms, the individual acts of defiance that preserved, against enormous institutional pressure, a more complete record of what was known. The sailors and pilots were the first and most consistent source of this resistance. A navigator who had sailed a particular coast had a survival interest in possessing accurate charts of that coast. Official prohibition or not, many pilots maintained private copies of the charts they had used, sometimes traced, sometimes reconstructed from memory, sometimes simply retained in defiance of the orders requiring surrender. Several surviving Portolan charts bear marginal annotations in multiple hands, in multiple inks, suggesting that the same chart passed through a chain of custodians over decades, each one adding observations, each one choosing not to destroy what they had received. The collector communities of Italy and the Netherlands provided a second layer of preservation. The humanist tradition of the 15th and 16th centuries placed enormous value on rare and unusual manuscripts, regardless of their legal status. Wealthy collectors in Florence, Venice, and Amsterdam assembled private libraries that included, alongside classical texts and natural history manuscripts, geographic materials of questionable provenance. The collection of Nicolas de Nicolet, a French geographer and traveller who assembled one of the largest private geographic libraries of the 16th century, contained materials that bore unmistakable evidence of having been copied without authorization from official Spanish and Portuguese sources. Nicolet preserved them not out of political conviction, but out of scholarly acquisitiveness. He wanted to own things that were rare. The irony is that his greed served history better than any amount of principled resistance. The Jewish merchant networks that carried geographic knowledge across the borders of the Inquisition's reach have already been mentioned in the context of the Cresques family, but their role in preservation extended beyond that specific lineage. The commercial diaspora created by the expulsions of 1492 and 1497, deposited geographic knowledge in cities across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Near East, Venice, Antwerp, Salonika, Istanbul, Cairo. In each of these cities, the arriving families brought manuscripts, charts, and the geographic knowledge held in their memories. And in each city, that knowledge was integrated into local commercial and cartographic traditions. The destruction intended by the expulsions was never complete, because knowledge that lives in networks does not die when one node is destroyed. And the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, maintained an internal communication network of extraordinary reliability, regular courier services between their missions worldwide, secure archives at the major Jesuit colleges, a tradition of careful record-keeping that was, in its own way, as thorough as the Casa de Contrataciones. Jesuit missionaries in the Americas, in Asia, and in Africa were some of the finest scientific observers of their era, and they transmitted what they observed back to Rome. What arrived in Rome was preserved. Some of it was published in carefully managed form. Much more of it was not. The Jesuit archive that accumulated over 2 centuries of worldwide observation is among the largest repositories of historical geographic intelligence in existence, and its full contents remain to this day incompletely known to the outside world. In the autumn of 1501, an Italian man named Alberto Cantino arrived in Lisbon. He was travelling under a commercial cover, a horse trader by his own account. His actual employer was Ercole I d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, one of the most sophisticated patrons of the Italian Renaissance, a man who understood the value of geographic intelligence with a precision that matched his appreciation for art and music. The Duke had sent Cantino to obtain a map. Not any map. The map, Portugal's most current, most comprehensive, most secret representation of the world as Portuguese navigators had come to know it. The map that incorporated everything the padrão reel contained, everything the pilots had reported, everything the Casa de India held under lock. The map that showed the world as it actually was, rather than as any other power in Europe knew it to be. How Cantino obtained access to what he needed is not known with certainty. What is known is that he spent approximately a year in Lisbon, cultivating contacts, spending money, moving carefully through the social world of the city's commercial and cartographic establishments. At some point during that year, he identified an anonymous Portuguese cartographer willing to make a copy of the master chart for a sum of money that the documents describe only as 12 gold ducats, a modest fee in retrospect. For the most sensitive document in the world, the copy was completed. Cantino rolled it carefully, concealed it within a shipment of goods, leaving Lisbon harbour, and transported it overland to Ferrara. He delivered it to the Duke in November 1502. He was never heard from again. The map that bears his name, though he did not make it, and the person who did make it is unknown, is now held in the Biblioteca Estense in Modena, Italy. It is one of the most studied and most admired cartographic documents in existence. Its depiction of the African coastline, the Indian Ocean, the Caribbean islands, and the coast of South America is accurate to a degree that no other surviving map of its era approaches. It shows geographic knowledge that by the official historical record European cartographers should not yet have possessed. Should the Cantino Planisphere is not just a beautiful object and a historical curiosity. It is evidence. It is evidence that Portugal's master map existed, that the Padrão real, or something very like it, was real and was comprehensive and showed a world far more fully known than the official record acknowledges. And it raises a question that has never been answered. If the copy shows this much, what did the original show? The map that was never stolen. The map that was updated continuously for decades after the Cantino copy was made. The map that incorporated everything Portugal's pilots learned in the century of exploration that followed. That original, if it survived at all, which is not certain, has never been found. It was never published. Its existence was never officially acknowledged as the most comprehensive geographic document in human history. At its moment of creation, either burned in some forgotten archive fire, or lies somewhere behind a door that has not been opened in 500 years. The Cantino Planisphere, sitting under glass in Modena, is its faint shadow, the echo of something that was, for one brief moment in 1502, the most dangerous piece of parchment in the world. There is a sea monster on a Portuguese chart of the Indian Ocean, dated to approximately 1519. It is painted in careful detail, sinuous body, open mouth, a texture that suggests scales, and it sits in a specific position relative to the coastlines around it, occupying a particular patch of water with what appears to be decorative enthusiasm. It is the kind of feature that a church official reviewing the map for doctrinal compliance would note with approval. Evidence of the wonders of God's creation. The kind of pious adornment that good Christian cartographers added to their work. The sea monster is not decoration, it is a current marker. Its position corresponds to a seasonal reversal in the Indian Ocean current pattern, a reversal that experienced pilots needed to know about, and that showing as a labelled navigation note would have attracted the attention of the Casa de Contrataciones intelligence reviewers. The monster's orientation, the angle of its body relative to the coastline, encodes the direction of the current during the dangerous monsoon season. A pilot who knew the language could read it in seconds. An official who did not would see a charming creature and move on. This is cartographic cryptography, the art of hiding sensitive information inside the visual conventions of the map itself. It was not unique to this one chart or this one cartographer. It was a practice developed over decades by a community of professionals who needed to communicate what they knew without exposing what they knew to the people reviewing their work. The cartouches, the decorative frames that surrounded the title and dedication text on Renaissance maps, were among the most versatile encoding spaces available. Their elaborate visual programs, drawn by skilled artists and filled with allegorical figures, heraldic symbols, and classical references, could carry secondary meanings, legible only to viewers who knew what to look for. The arrangement of figures and the specific attributes they carried, the direction in which they faced, all of these could be used to convey information that the official text of the map could not contain. Abraham Ortelius used the margins of the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum with particular subtlety. Along the southern edge of his world map, a series of figure groupings, women, scholars, classical personifications, were arranged in a sequence that cartographic historians have spent decades analyzing. The most persuasive interpretation, developed by researchers working at the intersection of art history and the history of cartography, is that the sequence encodes a reference to a southern continent whose existence Ortelius knew but could not officially claim. The figures, read in their classical allegorical register, I suggest a land of extraordinary size and unknown character, lying beyond the southern rim of the mapped world, a land that would, if acknowledged, require an entirely new framework for understanding the Earth's geography. Ortelius could not put that continent on his map. The political and religious pressures against it were too strong, but he could not bring himself to entirely suppress knowledge he considered genuine. So he hid it in the decoration. He wrote it in a language that only a small number of educated readers would recognize, and trusted that somewhere, in some library, in some scholar's working room, the right reader would eventually find it. The map was a dual-layer document. One layer was for the authorities. One layer was for the initiated. And between those two layers, in the space of a single sheet of parchment, was held the tension of an entire era, the gap between what was known and what was permitted to be known, expressed in the only language available to a man who could not afford to say it plainly. No geographic secret in the history of cartography has been more persistent, more widely distributed, and more carefully encoded than the southern continent, the enormous land mass that appears and reappears in European maps across more than 3 centuries, always in the same general location, always with varying degrees of specificity, always attributed to sources that are never quite fully explained. It appears first in Ptolemy's Geographia as a theoretical symmetry, a landmass posited at the southern end of the earth to balance the known landmasses of the north. This was not observation, it was geometry. Ptolemy needed a balanced earth, and a balanced earth required a southern land. He drew it speculatively and labelled it accordingly. Then something changes. The Fra Mauro map of 1450, produced by a Venetian monk working from an extraordinary synthesis of Arab, Asian, and European geographic knowledge, shows a southern land mass with a specificity that goes well beyond theoretical symmetry. The coastline has a shape, the interior has features, the representation is not schematic. It looks to modern eyes trained on satellite imagery like something observed. The Piri Reis map of 1513 goes further still. The Admiral's own annotation on the map states that the southern portion was drawn from maps, plural, that he had obtained from various sources, including, he claimed, sources that predated Columbus. The southern coastline he drew contains specific features, bays, promontories, a general outline that correspond in ways that have been noted by multiple independent researchers to the subglacial topography of Antarctica. Not the ice-covered surface, but the land beneath the ice, a surface that was not mapped until the seismic surveys of the International Geophysical Year, 1957 to 1958. This is not a small anomaly. The subglacial topography of Antarctica is not visible from the surface or from the sea. It requires either direct observation of the coastline before the current ice sheet formed, which would imply a date many thousands of years ago, or access to source materials of extraordinary antiquity that somehow preserve that information into the 16th century. Researchers who have examined the Piri Reis map's southern section have not reached agreement about what it represents. They have not been able to dismiss it, either. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 shows the southern continent at its most extraordinary. Orontius was a French mathematician and cosmographer, a professor at the Collège Royal in Paris, a man of substantial scholarly reputation. His world map, which he clearly considered one of his most important works, shows an Antarctic continent of roughly circular shape occupying the southern polar region, with a clearly delineated coastline, interior mountain ranges, and a river system. The river system implies a temperate climate. Antarctica today has no rivers. Before the ice sheet formed, it did. The southern continent appeared on official Spanish cartography until the 1560s, when it was formally ordered removed on the grounds that its existence had not been verified by official Spanish expeditions. The order is documented. The maps produced after the order show the relevant area as blank ocean. The southern continent did not disappear because it had been disproved. It disappeared because it had been prohibited. It came back in 1773 when Captain James Cook's circumnavigation of the Southern Ocean encountered pack ice at latitudes consistent with a continental mass, and returned to Britain with the report that a continent, if it existed, lay beneath the ice. Antarctica was officially discovered in 1820. The maps that had been drawing it since 1450 were by that point being studied in the same scholarly institutions that were sending the ships south to find it. No one in the official record drew the connection, and modern imaging technology has done something to the study of Renaissance maps that no amount of archival searching or scholarly interpretation could accomplish on its own. It has made the past visible in layers, not just the surface that survives, but what lies beneath it. Not just the map that was filed in the archive, but the map that existed before someone decided to change it. Multispectral analysis works by illuminating a document with light at specific wavelengths that the human eye cannot see, then capturing the reflectance data and processing it into images that reveal chemical residues invisible in the visual spectrum. Infrared reflectography captures the traces of earlier drawings and inscriptions that lie beneath layers of paint or ink. X-ray fluorescence maps the distribution of specific mineral compounds across a document's surface, revealing where different inks were applied and in what sequence. Computed tomography can read the interior of a sealed object without opening it. Applied to maps, these technologies have produced results that rewrite the history of specific documents. In the case of the Waldseemüller 1507 map, the single surviving copy of the map that named America, X-ray fluorescence analysis has revealed traces of earlier engraving lines on the printing plate that do not correspond to the lines in the surviving print. The plate was modified. Earlier content was removed and replaced. What the earlier content showed is impossible to determine from the traces that remain, but the modification itself is documented fact. The map that exists today is not the map that was first engraved. It is a revised version of it. A 2019 study of a Portuguese Portolan chart held in the Biblioteca Nacional in Lisbon revealed beneath the chart's visible coastline of West Africa traces of an earlier coastal outline that extended significantly further south. The visible chart shows a specific terminus, a point beyond which the known coast ends, the earlier outline, visible under multispectral analysis, shows coastline continuing past that terminus. The visible chart is in technical terms a redaction. Someone produced a more accurate map, then painted a less accurate version over it, and filed the less accurate version in the official collection, and there is the sealed codex. In 1987, during renovation work at a building associated with the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico in Mexico City, a collection of bound manuscripts was discovered in a sealed storage space. The collection was identified as Jesuit in origin, dating from the 17th century. Among the bound volumes was a codex, a sewn gathering of folded pages that had never been unfolded. The binding made unfolding it, without damage, impossible by ordinary means. Computed tomography of the codex's interior has revealed that the folded pages contain cartographic content. Maps drawn in ink on prepared paper, visible as faint traces through the CT imaging. The content of those maps has not been examined directly. The pages have not been opened. Permission to physically access the codex has been requested repeatedly by researchers at the university and at institutions in Europe. That permission has been denied, each time by the Vatican, which maintains authority over the Jesuit archive, of which the codex is technically a part. There are maps in a sealed book in a university archive in Mexico City that no researcher has ever seen. They have been there since the 17th century. Modern technology has confirmed they exist, and the institution that controls access to them has been saying no for 40 years. The burning rooms, it turns out, are still open for business. The fire has simply changed its form. In 2010, a team of researchers flying over the Bolivian Amazon in a small plane equipped with a LiDAR sensor, a laser-based imaging system that fires millions of pulses of light per second and measures their reflections to map terrain in extraordinary detail, began to see something beneath the jungle canopy that the maps of that region had never shown. Geometric earthworks, roads, canals, reservoirs, the foundations of structures, the organized patterns of a civilization that had shaped the land over centuries. By the time the surveys were complete and the data had been analyzed and published, the picture that emerged was staggering. The Bolivian Amazon, widely considered until very recently to be a region of scattered small-scale indigenous groups living in unmodified forest, had, in the pre-contact period, supported a network of connected urban settlements covering over 500 square kilometers. The population supported by those settlements has been estimated conservatively in the millions. This civilization, the Llanos de Mojos culture, had not been unknown in the historical literature. There were references to it in 16th century Spanish documents. Those documents had been classified for centuries as exaggerations. The inflated reports of conquistadors seeking to justify their expeditions to royal patrons by describing the wealth and scale of what they were conquering. The documents described cities, roads, agricultural systems, populations. Official colonial history dismissed them. The LiDAR surveys did not. The laser saw what the official record had declared invisible, when the survey maps were laid over the surviving 16th century Spanish documents describing the region. The correspondence was precise. The documents were not exaggerations. They were accurate observations, subsequently reclassified as fantastical to serve the needs of a colonial narrative that required the Amazon to be empty. The Maya case is equally striking. LiDAR surveys of the Yucatan Peninsula and the Guatemalan highlands, published between 2010 and 2022, have revealed the classic Maya urban network at a scale that rewrites everything previously estimated about its size and organization. The surveys have identified over 60,000 structures, temples, palaces, roads, agricultural systems, across an area of roughly 2,000 square kilometers. The civilization supported by these structures was, see, in terms of population density and infrastructure complexity, broadly comparable to pre-industrial Europe. The earliest Spanish reports of the Maya, written by conquistadors and missionaries in the 1520s, described cities, populations, and organizational complexity that subsequent colonial administration dismissed as typical soldiers' exaggeration. The LiDAR surveys confirm the soldiers were right. The dismissal was the distortion, and the Congo Basin satellite imaging surveys published in 2018 identified geometric earthwork formations across the basin floor, consistent with large-scale, organized agricultural management. Patterns requiring sustained collective effort, coordinated planning, and a population large enough to carry it out. Gay Moorish geographic documents from before 1550 depicted features in exactly this area of Central Africa. Those features had been removed from official European cartographic representations of the region after the mid-16th century, in the period when the Congo Basin became central to the Atlantic slave trade. The pattern is the same across all three cases. A civilization existed. It was described in early documents. Those documents were dismissed. The cartographic evidence was removed. Centuries later, a technology that did not exist when the maps were burned looked through the jungle and the grass and found everything that had been declared not to exist. The scientists who conducted these surveys were not looking for vindication of old maps. They were looking for ancient cities. They found both simultaneously. When a researcher overlays a LiDAR survey result with a 16th century forbidden map showing the same region, the correspondence is not approximate or suggestive. In several documented cases, it is specific enough to force the question of how the mapmaker knew where to draw what they drew. The LiDAR does not prove the existence of pre-Columbian contact or resolve the mystery of the burning, but it does one thing with absolute finality. It proves the maps were not fantasies. They were observations, careful, accurate, detailed observations of a real world that someone, at some specific moment, was allowed to see clearly and then instructed to make invisible. Let us also acknowledge what the satellite archaeology reveals about the cartographic suppression in a different register. Not just that it happened, but what it cost. And every city that was declared not to exist continued not to exist in the official record for centuries. Every population that was erased from the maps was also erased from the legal and moral accounting of conquest. The people who lived in those cities, whose ancestors had built those roads and dug those canals and maintained those agricultural systems across generations, were subjected to violence that was justified in part by the assertion that they had built nothing of consequence. The map was the deed, the blank space was the sentence, and the sentence was carried out on millions of people whose civilizations the burning rooms had made officially invisible. The maps were right, not the official maps, the forbidden ones, the ones that showed too much, the ones that were burned, they were right, and the people who burned them knew they were right, which is why they had to burn them. In 1965, a small map acquired by Yale University was announced to the world with a claim so significant that it dominated international headlines for weeks. The Vinland map, as it became known, was described as a 15th century Norse chart depicting the North American coastline, predating Columbus's 1492 voyage and providing cartographic evidence of the Norse settlement of North America at a time when the academic mainstream had not yet fully accepted that settlement as historical fact. The subsequent 50 years have been, for the Vinland map, a process of sustained and unresolved scientific interrogation. Carbon dating of the parchment, conducted in multiple independent studies, has consistently returned dates in the range of 1420 to 1450, consistent with the claimed 15th century origin. This is not contested. The parchment is old. The question is whether the map was drawn on old parchment in the 15th century or drawn on old parchment in the 20th century by someone attempting to produce a convincing forgery. Chemical analysis of the ink complicated the picture dramatically. A 1974 study identified a compound in the ink, anatase titanium dioxide, in a specific particle form that had not, according to the study's authors, been produced in that form before the 20th century. This appeared to be decisive evidence of forgery, but subsequent analyses challenged the methodology. In later studies, identified anatase in medieval manuscripts produced centuries before the supposed production date of the synthetic compound. The ink analysis was contested, then partially retracted, then contested again. The Vinland map remains, as of the most current published research, genuinely unresolved. It is not definitively authentic. It is not definitively forged. It occupies a strange space in cartographic scholarship, a document too significant to dismiss and too contested to accept. The documentary presents this not as a failure of science, but as an illustration of how difficult it is to reach certainty about the past from the evidence the past has left behind. The Cantino Planisphere offers a more satisfying story. Analysis of its vellum composition and ink chemistry are published in 2015 by researchers at the University of Modena, confirmed its dating to within 5 years of 1502, and identified the geographic origin of its vellum as southern Portugal, consistent with production in or near Lisbon. The analysis also confirmed that the map is entirely a product of its stated era. No later additions, no modifications, no materials inconsistent with early 16th century Portuguese production. The Cantino Planisphere is exactly what it appears to be. The Piri Reis map has been subject to extensive material analysis since its rediscovery in the Topkapi Palace archives in 1929. Pigment analysis has identified mineral compounds in the inks consistent with early 16th century Ottoman cartographic production. The parchment has been dated to the correct era. No materials inconsistent with a 1513 production date have been identified. Whatever questions remain about the map's source knowledge, there are no credible grounds for questioning its authenticity as a document of its era. And then there is the so-called Medici chart, a portolan chart recently identified in a private Florentine collection, whose parchment has been carbon dated to the 1420s. Its ink composition is consistent with Venetian cartographic workshops of the early 15th century. If the dating is correct, it is the earliest surviving depiction of Atlantic coastlines in European cartography, predating by decades any previously known map showing that region. The Medici chart has not yet been fully published or subject to comprehensive scholarly review. It sits in a private collection, its implications not yet absorbed into the academic literature. Materials science cannot tell us everything about these maps. It cannot tell us where the mapmakers got their knowledge. It cannot explain the accuracy that exceeds what should have been possible. But it can tell us that the documents are real, that they were made when they appear to have been made, and that the mystery they represent is not a forgery or a misidentification, but a genuine historical puzzle with genuine historical weight. If we accept, as the material evidence strongly suggests we should, that certain Renaissance maps depict geographic features with an accuracy that the officially documented voyages of their era cannot account for, then we are left with a question that the evidence demands and the field has not resolved. How did they know? There are three serious answers to this question, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is what scholars call the diffusion model. Geographic knowledge, in this account, accumulated gradually across centuries through networks of maritime trade and cultural exchange that were broader and more complex than the European-centered narrative of discovery acknowledges. Arab geographers in the medieval period possessed remarkable knowledge of the world's geography. The 12th century world map of al-Idrisi, produced for the Norman king Roger II of Sicily, is accurate to a degree that European cartography would not match until the 16th century. Chinese naval expeditions under Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century reached East Africa, the Indian Ocean, and possibly further. Indian Ocean trading networks had been in continuous operation for thousands of years before European ships entered the area. When Portuguese explorers began making contact with these networks, they were not discovering an unknown world. They were entering a world that other civilizations had known for centuries, and some of whose knowledge was available through Arabic and Asian intermediaries to careful and well-connected European cartographers. The second explanation is the undocumented voyage model. In this account, European sailors made expeditions that were never officially recorded, either because they were undertaken covertly in defiance of royal restrictions on unauthorized navigation, or because the knowledge they produced was immediately classified and removed from the accessible record. The circumstantial evidence for this model, the anomalous coastlines, the accurate interiors, the islands that appear and disappear, is substantial. The direct evidence is, almost by definition, absent. Undocumented voyages leave no documentation. The model is plausible. It cannot be proven. The third explanation is the ancient source model. In this account, certain Renaissance cartographers were working from source materials of genuinely ancient origin, charts or geographic traditions produced by civilizations whose knowledge of the world's geography has been largely lost to history. Reis himself claimed this. Specifically, he said he drew from maps in Columbus's possession that were themselves copies of older maps. The claim has been dismissed by many scholars as a device to lend authority to his work. The others have taken it seriously. The Antarctic question, if the Reis map really does show subglacial Antarctic topography, implies either a source of extraordinary antiquity or a coincidence of such improbability that coincidence is not a satisfying explanation. None of these three explanations is entirely satisfying. None of them is entirely implausible. The honest position, the position that the evidence actually supports, is that the accuracy of certain forbidden maps probably has more than one explanation, that different maps were accurate for different reasons, and that the full picture is more complex than any single theory can accommodate. What is not in doubt is this: the knowledge was there. It existed in specific and recoverable form on specific pieces of parchment, and someone, more than one someone, it acting across more than a century, in more than one country, decided that it should not exist. The burning was not an attempt to destroy ignorance. It was an attempt to destroy a knowledge that was already complete. That knowledge is the ghost that haunts the rest of this story, because the people who tried to make it disappear did not entirely succeed, and what they failed to burn, they tried to hide, and what they hid, and what is still being hidden, that is what the final chapter of this story is about. There is something worth sitting with in that final point. The people who ordered the burning were not fools. They understood, at some level, that destroying a map did not destroy the territory it depicted. The Amazon was still there. The cities of the Llanos de Mojos were still there. And the subglacial coastline of Antarctica was still there. What the burning accomplished was not the elimination of reality. It was the elimination of the record of human knowledge about reality. They were not trying to unmake the world. They were trying to unmake the fact that the world had been known. That distinction is everything. It tells us that the burning was motivated not by fear of geography, but by fear of a history that was inconvenient, that assigned priority and knowledge and agency to people and traditions that the official story required to be absent. The fire was aimed at a narrative, not a coastline. Open a mapping application on your phone. Type in an address anywhere in the world, and within seconds a satellite image will appear, detailed, current, freely available. So you can zoom to the level of individual trees. You can read the numbers on a street address. You can see the shadow cast by a building at a specific time of day. This is the most democratized form of geographic knowledge in human history, or so it appears. Look closer. There are places you cannot see. In Israel, commercial satellite providers operating under US law are prohibited by the Cartography Amendment from selling imagery of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories at resolutions higher than those available from the best commercially available non-US sources, which effectively means that the most detailed imagery available in public applications is deliberately degraded for that region. Specific military and intelligence facilities around the world appear in commercial satellite imagery as blurred patches, pixelated squares, or in some cases, frozen in imagery from years ago, with current views blocked. The list of blurred locations is not publicly available. It is itself classified. The practice of deliberately degrading or blocking geographic imagery is not performed uniformly across national versions of the same application. Google Maps, for example, shows different levels of detail in different countries depending on agreements with local governments. What you see when you search for a location depends not just on where the location is, but on where you are searching from. The geography of your world is adjusted quietly and without announcement to suit the political needs of the government under whose jurisdiction you are using the service. In disputed territories, this becomes particularly stark. The South China Sea, where China claims sovereignty over islands also claimed by Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei, is depicted differently in Chinese map applications than in applications available in the other claiming countries. The islands exist on all versions of the map, but their names, their administrative labels, their relationship to claimed boundaries are adjusted to reflect the political preferences of the platform's operating government. There is no single, neutral, universally available version of that map. There are multiple versions, each one shaped by a different political claim, each one presenting its version as the accurate one. In 2019, a researcher working on pre-contact Amazon archaeology attempted to obtain high-resolution satellite imagery of a location identified by LiDAR surveys as a significant archaeological site, a concentration of earthworks consistent with a substantial pre-contact settlement. When she attempted to access the imagery through a commercial satellite service, she found that the imagery for that specific area had been pixelated. The pixelation was not the result of cloud cover or data unavailability. When she contacted the service provider, she was told that the imagery suppression had been requested by the government of the country in which the site was located. The site was not a military installation. It was not a nuclear facility or a government compound. It was an archaeological site. Someone, some government, I'm acting through the standard mechanisms of the modern information economy, had looked at the evidence of an ancient civilization and requested that a commercial company make it invisible. The tools have changed. Vellum has become satellite data. The burning room has become a terms of service document. The soldier with the torch has become an API call. But the decision, who sees what, about which territory, for whose benefit, is the same decision that was being made in the stone warehouses of Seville in the summer of 1527, and it is still being made every day by institutions whose names we know and whose interests we can, if we choose, follow. Let us take stock. After everything this documentary has examined, the burning rooms, the silence cartographers, the encoded maps, the spectral imaging, and the LiDAR surveys, what do we actually know? And what still do we not know? We know, with documentary certainty, that at least 11 major state-ordered destructions of cartographic materials occurred between 1497 and 1617, targeting maps of the Atlantic world produced under Spanish and Portuguese royal auspices. We know that the Padrão Real, Portugal's secret master map, existed, was maintained continuously for over a century and has never been found. We know that the 1507 Waldseemüller Map was printed in 1,000 copies and that 999 of those copies have vanished. As we know that the 1550 Seville Purge was documented in destruction registries that survive in the Archivo General de Indias. We know that spectral imaging has revealed earlier, more detailed coastlines hidden beneath the surface of surviving official maps. We know, with varying degrees of evidentiary confidence, that certain Renaissance maps show geographic knowledge of the Amazon, of the Antarctic, of the interior Americas and Africa, that the officially documented voyages of their era cannot explain. We know that LiDAR surveys have confirmed, in multiple locations, the existence of the large-scale civilizations that the destroyed and suppressed maps described, and that the official colonial narrative declared not to exist. We know that material analysis has confirmed the authenticity of the Cantino Planisphere, the Piri Reis map, and other controversial documents. What we do not know, what may never be known, is the source of the anomalous geographic knowledge that certain maps contain, whether it came from undocumented voyages, from ancient source maps, from the accumulated intelligence of non-European geographic traditions, or from some combination of all three. The evidence does not permit certainty. The question remains genuinely open. And then there is what is known to exist but remains inaccessible: the sealed Jesuit Codex in Mexico City, the undigitized holdings of the Portuguese Torre do Tombo archive, over 400,000 documents from the age of exploration, the majority of which have never been read by researchers outside Portugal. The Vatican Apostolic Archives, cartographic holdings, whose catalogue has never been published and whose full scope is not known to any researcher outside the institution. 400,000 unread documents in a single archive from a single century, of a single country's exploration of a world that was, in that century, in the process of being comprehensively mapped for the first time by European powers. The investigation is not complete. It has barely begun. The digital age has made the accessible materials more accessible. Researchers today can study the Cantino Planisphere from anywhere in the world, can access spectral imaging data from institutional collections without traveling to the institutions, can correlate cartographic and archaeological data in ways that were not possible a generation ago. The tools are better. The picture is sharper. But the picture is also, in its newly sharpened form, more clearly showing us what it does not contain. Every archive that has been digitized reveals the size of the archive that has not been digitized. On every map that has been imaged under multispectral analysis reveals the existence of the maps that have not. Every sealed codex that has been scanned reveals that there are other sealed codices whose contents have not been scanned. The more we see, the more precisely we can identify what we have not yet been allowed to see. The maps that have been found have already rewritten our understanding of the early modern world. The maps that are still hidden in private collections, in institutional archives, in stone niches behind walls that have not yet been opened, are waiting. Whatever they contain, they have been waiting for a long time. Return to Seville. Return to the warehouse, the stone walls, the amber light, the smell of burning vellum. Return to the soldier who paused, he was not a hero in the conventional sense. He did not defy his orders out of principle or stand in the doorway and refuse to burn. He did what he was told, mostly. He burned what he was told to burn, mostly. But something in him paused at one map, studied it for a moment in the firelight, and decided, quietly and without announcement, that this particular thing should not disappear. We do not know what was on that map. The map that survived bears scorch marks, but is otherwise intact, which means it showed whatever it showed before it entered the firelight and after it left concealed beneath a coat. We do not know if what it showed was important or ordinary, accurate or exaggerated, unique or redundant. We know only that someone thought it was worth the risk of keeping, at a moment when the risk was real. That hesitation, that quiet, private, individual decision to preserve rather than destroy, is the recurring figure in this entire story. It appears in different forms and different centuries. The monk who tucked charts into a wall before the inspection arrived. The spy who rolled a Planisphere into a wine shipment. The pilot who kept a private copy of the charts he was supposed to surrender. The humanist collector who paid too much for a manuscript of uncertain legal provenance because he recognized that it showed something no other map showed. None of these people were revolutionaries. None of them declared their resistance publicly or wrote manifestos about the freedom of geographic knowledge. They were practical people operating in dangerous environments who made specific decisions about specific objects at specific moments of risk. The cumulative effect of those individual decisions is the archive we are still working through today. Imperfect, partial, but real. The fragments of a more complete picture of the world, preserved because enough individual people, across enough centuries, chose not to burn what they had been told to burn. What does that tell us about the present? The burning has not stopped. The maps are not safer than they were in 1527. The institutions that control geographic knowledge, governments, corporations, international bodies, religious organizations, have not become more transparent in their relationship to what they know and what they choose to reveal. If anything, the sophistication of modern information control makes the Renaissance burning rooms look clumsy and obvious by comparison. A 16th century official ordering a warehouse fire was visible, traceable, documentable. An algorithm that degrades satellite imagery or a terms of service clause that permits a government to request pixelation of an archaeological site is invisible, technical, and embedded in infrastructure that most people use without questioning. The question that this documentary ends on is not a historical question. It is a present one. What maps are being burned right now? Not in stone warehouses, but in data centers. Not by soldiers, but by API requests. Not by order of kings, but by the standard operating procedures of companies whose geographic data products are used by billions of people and whose decisions about what to show and what to hide are made in meetings to which no one outside those companies is invited. A map is not a drawing. That is what the soldier in the warehouse understood, even as he lit his first torch. A map is an argument. It argues that a specific piece of the world exists, is real, has specific features, belongs to specific people. To make a map is to make a claim. To burn a map is to unmake a claim. And some claims, once unmade, Some cities, once erased, some coastlines, once scraped from the parchment, are very difficult to restore. The forbidden cartographers knew this. The people who burn their maps knew this. The researcher looking at a pixelated Amazon knows it even if she cannot quite name it yet. We are still inside the story. The fire is still burning. The question is not whether we can stop it. The question is whether enough of us will pause, as that soldier paused, and decide that this, whatever this specific thing is, at this specific moment, should not disappear.